While most presidents wore suit jackets, ties, and dress pants all the time, you don't have to any longer. Because Presidents Unplugged has merch. If you want to check out some new shirts to buy as a nice gift for somebody in your family or just something that you want yourself, go to presidentsunpluggedmerch.com to check out new shirts, hoodies, crew necks, and anything else that you can dream of. Now in many more colors and new designs coming soon. I'm very excited for the Presidents Unplugged merch store to finally be open. Now, let's get back to the show. Around 100 million people voted in the election of 2000, deciding what president would take us into the new millennium. Pretty important stuff. With over 100 million people voting, a difference of 1 million votes would be pretty close. 500,000 votes would be even closer. 100,000 votes would be catastrophic. But what if I told you that this entire election was decided by 537 votes? That's 0.0001% of the American population. And let's just say, that's a lot of decimal places. Why was this election so close in the first place? And why should we as Americans today really care about this election from 25 years ago? Let's do this. At the center of the election of 2000 were two politicians that were a little bit more similar than a lot of people think. Al Gore, Bill Clinton's vice president for all 8 years of his presidency, and George W. Bush, the son of 41st President George H.W. Bush. What a lot of people don't realize is that Al Gore's dad, Albert Gore Sr., served in Congress for more than 30 years, and he was considered one of the major Democratic voices of his era. But at the same time, George H.W. Bush was rising through the Republican ranks, first as a congressman, then an ambassador, and then he became the CIA director, and then Ronald Reagan was like, come on my ticket. He became the vice president, and after Reagan served a very successful 8 years, Bush Sr. became the president. And even though he obviously didn't get reelected in 1992, he did do some good things in his presidency. Not all great, but he did some good. But with all this happening, I don't know, him becoming the president, it overshadowed Al Gore's dad, Al Gore Sr. This makes Albert Gore Sr. not really even known at all. He's very in the shadows. But it's still nice to look back with a historical standpoint to say that these fathers had no idea that their sons would be fighting it out in the 2000 election. And with George H.W. Bush's popularity, his son also gained that popularity and became the governor of Texas in the 90s. So they were all doing things in different directions. But while Bush Jr. might have been the governor of Texas, Al Gore was the vice president to Bill Clinton. I don't know, the guy that beat George Bush Sr. in the election. So after Bill Clinton beat George Bush Sr., I promise we're about to be out of the Bush Sr., Bush Jr. stuff, Al Gore became Clinton's vice president. And for 8 years, Clinton and Gore looked over one of the most stable economic periods in modern American history. If you want to learn more about it, look at the episode Saxophone's Success and Scandal, the Bill Clinton episode. Al Gore, in his own right, was extremely talented in many categories. He was serious, and he was really knowledgeable on foreign affairs especially. But he lacked charisma. As the internet was rising in popularity, people would joke online that he was almost like a robot. And he was so stiff in debates, even when he was funny or sharp, you couldn't really tell because he was just standing there. And he made some voters feel like he was inauthentic. He didn't even feel real. George W. Bush, on the other hand, was completely different. He struggled with articulating his thoughts and the detail. He wasn't really viewed as the most intellectual candidate, which to a lot of people is a little bit of a problem. His verbal mess-ups became late-night TV's comedy fuel, and in a time before social media, late-night TV was the way that people heard about stuff and the way that people perceived things. So you making mess-ups, even though it can't be on social media, it would still be the joke in Saturday Night Live. But other than this, other than his mess-ups in public sometimes, he was really seen as a warm candidate. He was approachable, and he was someone that the American people could just imagine having a conversation with. So both candidates had their weaknesses and strengths, but a surprising thing about this election, especially looking back from today's lens, is that neither candidate really had a crazy successful campaign. Gore was kind of piggybacking off Clinton, and Bush Jr. was kind of piggybacking off his dad. Neither of them really said much about the other person. They kind of stayed in their lane, and overall, very pacifistic. There was no real drive on either side. And as we're about to hear, not having drive on either side is a bit of a problem when we know how close this election would end up being. By election night, Americans viewed the race as a battle of the lesser of two evils. Both candidates had strengths, yeah, but both candidates had glaring weaknesses, and the entire country seemed split right down the middle. But you know, as they always say, when times get tough, call the Sunshine State. Florida. Didn't mention it a lot, but Florida is a big debate in a lot of these elections. The election of 1876, the one we talked about last week, one of the 4 states that were debated was Florida. Florida, for some reason, is always thrown in the pile of, we don't know which way it's going to go. In a lot of these elections, Florida was extraordinarily close, and in this one, more than ever. Pretty much everywhere else in the United States, we use the ballot that we kind of know of today. The ballot where you have bubbles that you fill in with a pen or pencil to decide who you want to be the next president. It's very simple, it's very straightforward, and it makes a lot of sense. But some random counties in Florida decided that it was a little too difficult for older individuals. So they started this new form of ballot called the butterfly ballot. This was introduced as an easier way for older voters to vote for the president. Okay, that's nice, helping out the elderly. Instead, the butterfly ballot was 15,000 times more confusing than just a bubble that you do on a test in school. The butterfly ballot is one of the sole reasons the election of 2000 was so contested. With this new ballot, instead of just filling in a bubble with a pen or a pencil, you would poke a hole in a piece of paper to make your decision. What in the world were they thinking? The tools that they gave the people to punch the holes were extremely problematic because the second that that point isn't sharp, it'll rip the paper and even leave some left, and we'll talk about that later. In reality, it was extremely confusing and very poorly designed. Voters were supposed to punch that hole next to the candidate's name that they wanted, but the layout caused widespread misvotes. People voted for the wrong people because they didn't know what they were doing. That's a little bit of a problem in a tight election. In Palm Beach County, one of the debated Florida counties. Thousands of electors voted for the wrong person. Instead of voting for Bush or Gore, they voted for this third-party candidate named Pat Buchanan. Now, could they have just voted for Pat Buchanan because they liked the guy? Sure, they could have, but he was a third-party far-right candidate, and he was getting more votes in this county than anywhere else in the country. What's happening? It's because people didn't understand the new ballots. They just really didn't know how to punch in the right candidate. The ballots were so confusing that literal thousands of Floridians voted for the wrong candidate because they didn't know where to punch their little pin thing. Does this sound like a problem? Well, it is. There was a term going around at the time called chads. No, a chad is not just that random guy in your Bible study with a really good jawline. No. A chad is a small piece of paper that's supposed to fall out when you make your decision on these new punch-out ballots. But when that piece of paper doesn't come off cleanly, it creates problems like hanging chads. Pieces of paper that are still connected that can flap back and make it look like you haven't voted at all. These were such an issue because machines reading the ballots to see who people voted for, what were they supposed to count a hanging chad for? Maybe they just punched the paper but didn't mean to and were going to another candidate. It not only made it difficult for the robots or the machines that were processing these votes, it made it hard for even humans to decide what they really meant by these little pieces of paper. But it wasn't just a hanging chad. If people punched their card in a weird way, it would leave some other types of chads. Some were hanging, some were dimpled, some were pregnant. Chad must be a female. And because these cards didn't clearly show who you voted for once removed from the voting machine, people had no way to really confirm their choices. So not only were there pieces of paper that could make your vote not even count, but people didn't know who they were voting for. It was a mess. It was a bad time for an election system to collapse and stop working for the closest election in American history. So after looking at the electoral votes for the rest of the states in America, it was half and half. Florida was the main contributor. Whoever won Florida would win the entire election. And in some world, Florida's not the one that everyone's looking at, but Florida's votes were extremely important. And if this kind of stuff was happening in a state that was more one-sided, it wouldn't be that much of an issue. Until Florida was put center stage and they had a defective voting system. While George Washington himself might not have had an Instagram page, Presidents Unplugged does. If you want to see some presidential content and overall updates on the show, come to the Instagram at presidents_unplugged. See you there. When the votes were tallied for the first time, we weren't still really sure how we were going to classify these, quote, chads. So, we just kind of gave our number. So our first tally said that Bush was ahead in Florida, but only by about 1,700 votes. And when we're talking about the entire state of Florida, 1,700 votes is not that big of a majority. And after a bunch of overseas ballots, mostly by people in the military, were counted and all these early votes were put in, that margin shrank smaller and smaller and smaller. A majority of less than 1,700 in a state of 15 million. Yeah, this was not looking good. A bunch of news stations, because, we love the news here on Presidents Unplugged and how it gives everything so accurately without swayed opinions. The news channels were rushing to figure out this candidate that we were going to pick. So CNN, great channel, CNN projected that Florida had been won by George W. Bush. Hooray, yes, he won the election. Everyone cheers and screams. Oh, wait. This wasn't over. CNN, after calling that George Bush was the projected winner, all the other platforms went right onto it. They said, oh, Bush won, Bush won, Bush won. Al Gore, even though this wasn't quoted, I can just say it like he would, he probably shrugged his shoulders and said, oh man, well, this election didn't go my way. So we called George Bush and said, George W., congratulations on this election. I'm conceding at this time. Al Gore had a bunch of people on his team saying, do not concede this election. It is way too close to take that risk when you could possibly win. Gore was like, okay. So he called George Bush back right after he had just supposedly conceded to say, actually, no, it's way too close. That's what my chief executive person of my campaign is saying. So George Bush, kind of, I don't know, trying to make light of the situation, said, are you saying what I think you're saying? And Al Gore responded, note on this, by the way, just because Presidents Unplugged loves accuracy, this was not 100% confirmed that this conversation happened the way it did, but supposedly Al Gore responded saying, don't get snippy about it. Ooh! What in the high school girl drama is this? You get it, Gore. So they're going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But Gore really did have a point in this debate. He said that it was way too close to call this. I mean, when it's under 1,000 votes difference, and there were still getting votes in final counts to make the final decision, it did make sense for Gore to say it was his duty to let the process finish off, to make sure they have the right candidate. So George Bush kind of accepted and handed the call. The second phone call set the tone of what was to come. By the way, that phone call was at 2:30 a.m. I know you're probably asleep by then, but on election night, Ty Svensson stays up till about 4. Because election night is fun. Al Gore demanded not only that every vote be counted, but that recounts begin. Machines recounted the ballots, bringing Bush's lead down to the infamous number that we know today, 537. There was a 537 vote difference between Bush and Gore. 537 Americans. There was about 200 million Americans at that time, and 537 were deciding the entire country's presidential vote. And I would like to mention that the reason that this number had been so much closer was probably because the machines misreading hanging chads, pregnant chads, dimpled chads. So then, with this even closer number, Gore demanded manual recounts. Why are we trusting this machine? It's not even close to what a human can do. So the election workers began counting those ballots, and they were holding these punch cards up to the lights. They were squinting at these hanging chads, trying to determine, quote, voter intent, to figure out what did the voter mean. Why did this guy punch every single ballot? Don't they know that you're only supposed to vote for one person? Throw that ballot out. Wait, you can throw ballots out? When was that added? Yes, I would like to mention that votes are thrown out in a lot of elections. Votes that are incorrectly done, people who vote for more than one candidate, and people who just do it incorrectly. Some people make their vote for president the write-in candidate, and they also vote for the president. So do you count it as 2 or 1? Yeah, just throw it out. It's not good. So some were already invalid. But when do we consider the Chads invalid? Oh my goodness gracious, it is so difficult. And all this pressure, especially on Al Gore, really wanting them to count every single vote. But George Bush's idea was, technically, I'm winning right now. It might be a difference of 537, but in the grand scheme of things, I'm winning. So no more votes need to be counted. We're fine. I'm winning. Don't count anymore. So that's where the debate came up. And also, I'm just going to throw this in here because there's some things that we need to realize probably looked a little suspicious back in the day. I have two. First off, who was the governor of Florida in the election of 2000? I wonder. It was Jeb Bush, George Bush's brother. Yeah, that's 100% fair, even though really in the whole story, this doesn't have too much of a drive. It is kind of weird that Bush won in Florida, whatever. I'm not going to get into conspiracies. But here's one that I will definitely talk about. Secretary of State for Florida, Katherine Harris, was the Secretary of State for Jeb Bush, the governor at the time. So what does Katherine Harris have to do with anything? Well, Katherine Harris did something else. She was not just the Secretary of State for Florida. She was also one of the top people on the George W. Bush campaign. And what was the Secretary of State over? The voting process. So Katherine Harris and Jeb Bush, who leaned very Bush side of this election, were over major pieces of the recounts and all this stuff. So you wonder what the Democrats were mad about? That Bush had so many hands that he could shake in Florida to get his way. And I will tell you, even today, it looks extremely suspicious. Voters at the time, and still people today, believe that the combination of Katherine Harris's authority in the balloting system and Jeb Bush's governing created an unfair environment and perceptions that still spark debate today. But eventually, this is going to have to leave Florida. It is the United States' decision after all, isn't it? Eventually, the legal battle climbed all the way to the United States Supreme Court. In an extremely tight 5-4 decision, there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court, the court ruled that these recounts of votes were unconstitutional because different counties use different standards. And with these recounts halted, Bush's 537-vote lead stood. And just like that, George W. Bush became the 43rd president of the United States. That evening, Al Gore delivered one of the most gracious concession speeches in American history. Al Gore did take it like a man, and he decided that it would be the best for the American people to make a peaceful concession and not cause any more trouble. And this is how he started his concession speech. Just moments ago, I called Governor George W. Bush and congratulated him on becoming the 43rd President of the United States. And I promised him I wouldn't call back this time. He acknowledged in his speech that he strongly disagreed with the Supreme Court's decision. He reminded America that partisan ideas, I'm leaning left, I'm leaning right, must now be put aside. Even though Al Gore did disagree with certain decisions that our government made, he still took it upon himself to do the right thing and concede in order for our country to stand together. The second we start openly disagreeing and dividing ourselves even further, we forget that we're the United States of America, not the divided states of America. And As a person who, especially in this month, has looked into a lot of concession speeches, a lot of elections, a lot of results, we as a country need to deeply respect Al Gore for conceding in not a push for himself, but a push for the greater good of America. So I appreciate you, Al Gore. But after election season, after Gore conceded, after Bush became the 43rd American president, a lot of questions arise. What if scenarios? George Bush would lead the country for the next 8 years in some ways that a lot of people agree with, and some ways that a lot of people disagree with. He had defining leadership during the 9/11 terrorist attacks. If you want to see more on that, go to Towers, Terror, and Tragedy, my 9/11 episode, where I explain that George Bush's leadership defined America's response to that event. He was crucial in our response to 9/11. He started the war on terror, but then he invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, two decisions that are still the reason that a lot of people, including myself sometimes, disagree with George W. Bush. And the results of the war on terror that we still feel today. Why, when I go in the airport, do the TSA people pat me down and get mad at me because I had 3 liters of water instead of 2? I don't get it. But Bush's decisions were so vital in defining the 21st century. All these questions are very important. How would Al Gore have responded to 9/11? Al Gore, with his expansive foreign affairs experience, how would he have responded to Iraq and Afghanistan? And would America be a different place with that different leadership? And if so, would he have led for better or for worse? These are the questions that shape how we think. You are given the opportunity to go out and express what you want for America's future. Other countries can only dream of that kind of privilege. So take it. Use it. Go out and vote. 'Cause you never know. Your vote could always be one of 537 that define the path of a nation. These moments remind us that even in the closest and most bitter contests, the strength of our democracy depends not only on who wins, but on how we choose to move forward. And that is why the election of 2000 is so important. Tune in next Thursday on November 27th as we go to the President's Unplugged Thanksgiving special. What president made Thanksgiving a national holiday? Why did kids all around the nation learn about pilgrims on Thanksgiving? And why does the president pardon a turkey? Like, that thing would be tasty. Learn about that and much more next Thursday on President's Unplugged. Thank you for listening with me for almost 30 minutes about the election of 2000. I found it extremely entertaining, and I hope you did as well. I'm Ty Svensson, this is President's Unplugged, and I'll see you next week. God bless. We need to make an executive decision now. The executive decision to follow President's Unplugged on Apple Podcasts or Spotify today to be notified weekly that your favorite presidential podcast has released new content. Now, let's get back to the show.